So thank you everyone for being here today, number one, and to thank you again to our panelists who are here today for really kicking off our inaugural HR Sci meetup group, where we're going to talk about, at least in this case today, the generational differences talent professionals or talent management professionals are avoiding. And we use that word avoiding in a very provocative term to hopefully come up with some interesting answers or ideas and insights. And today with me, I have three people who are, for lack of a better word, my heroes in the talent management space. So I have Lauren Eager, John Madigan, Amit Parmar, and usually for these sessions, I have people talk about who they are because these individuals will never hype themselves up to the point that I think they should be hyping themselves up as. I'll go through each one of them really quick to tell them what they mean to me, and then they can go through their background in a little bit more detail. I'm going to start first with Lauren. Great news is it's Lauren's birthday today, so happy birthday, Lauren. That's why we have our sign up here, and it's backwards, of course. No good deed goes unpunished, but we try our best. Lauren, number one, is probably one of the most connected people I've ever come across. Every conversation I have with her leaves me thinking, why didn't I think of that a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? And I thought that she would be the perfect component to this webinar to really help us kick this off, to bring both her knowledge, her passion, and her skills into what's going on. I'll talk about John version 2.0 now next, just because he follows in that next part of my screen. John Madigan is the, excuse me, the Executive Talent Services CEO. He is a coach, a cheerleader, a person that has so much experience in the talent management space that when I first thought about this, John was the person that I needed to get for this session. So John, thank you for joining us today.
No pressure.
Yeah, there we go. And then my good buddy, Amit Parmar, CEO of Cliquify. He is probably the most positive person that I know. If I am 1% as positive as he is, I consider it a success in my daily day. So I love working with each of the three of you. And I just thought that if each one of you just wanted to take some quick time to go through a little bit of your background, and we can then go off to the races. So Lauren, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, John. I don't know if it'll be as good as your introduction for me.
It'll be better.
Okay, so I'll share that I have a rich background in startup incubation, venture capital, and I'm now a community and program manager at a company called AirVet. AirVet is an employee benefit that supports pet parents with on-demand telecare service. So I'm very excited about that and excited to share my insights about my generation, which for reference is right smack between millennial and Gen Z.
Perfect. All right, John.
Thank you, John. How many Johns, right? So my name is John Madigan. I run a company called Executive Talent Services. And what we do is we provide 3 services for companies and then 1 for individuals. On the company side, we do outplacement, executive coaching, and then consulting with, of all things, talent management. And then we have an individual service doing career coaching for executives that want to make a job change. And prior to that, I hate to admit it, over 20 years on the corporate side in places like the Hartford and Aetna, doing corporate HR. So
Perfect.
Thanks.
All right, last but certainly not least.
Thank you so much for having me here. Super excited to be here with an amazing set of folks here. My name's Amit. Been in talent and HR for over 20 years. Converted to become a SaaS founder of Cliquify, which is an employer brand activation platform. What it really means is how do we equip large global enterprises, or even just enterprises who have amazing cultures, to really share out there with their employees as well as potential candidates what their culture is like, so they can make more informed decisions about maybe even potentially working there. So excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Perfect. So again, thank all three of you. And just to let you know, John Kelly is behind the scenes right now, feverishly working with our with the YouTube stream. And if people do have questions or comments, you can add in that information there. He's going to then send it over to me, and I can ask this wonderful panel those burning ideas or questions that you may have. So to really start the ball rolling, initially this program or this webinar was really going to be surrounding that generational differences with talent management and how sometimes those could be avoided, or what are some of the other things that could be avoided. And interestingly enough, when John and I were first talking about this, John Madigan, he talked about, well, maybe we could also go a little bit more towards just in general that talent management, what might be avoided or what could we be using more of. So I don't know if that Tony Robbins quote holds true here, but where the focus goes, the energy flows. So I'm just going to keep it as very nebulous as our first starting topic and then see where it really leads us. The really big caveat here is that we're not looking to have all three of you be the experts in terms of if this is not happening, then you don't know what you're doing. It's more along the lines of here's what our perceptions of what's happening in the talent management market is doing, and let's just talk and have an interesting conversation about it in the hopes that that plants a seed somewhere with someone that might bring it back to their company or organization or group to help them be better and their organization be better. So that's really the purpose behind it. So, being the, individual that's trying to kick this off, I'll just pick a random person. And Amit, you start with the letter A. When I told you this, when I asked you this question, what was the first thing that you popped into your mind with?
Ask me the question about just what talent management leaders are potentially overlooking. Is that the question?
I like your very politically correct overlooking. You could be our PR person versus the avoid.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, look, being a talent management leader in this day and age, it's not an easy task, right? You've got so many massive shifts happening, and I'll focus this conversation on the U.S. kind of workforce for now, right? Of course, as you go global, a lot more complexity in how you think about your talent strategy and how you execute it. But in the U.S., you've got massive tectonic shifts that are happening, right? You've got trust issues between the employees and the institutions, and that includes employers and governments. And of course, I'm an avid follower of Edelman's Trust Barometer, so I read that. I think they just published the latest report a month or so ago. So there is that as the backdrop. You've got massive tech innovations that are happening. Of course, I haven't been part of any conversations of late that don't talk about AI, right?
Yep.
And so you've got this, speed of technology innovation that's happening and what it's doing to jobs potentially, or skills that are required to be successful in jobs, right? And then you have, if you look at the workforce, and I look at like the workforce from a like stratigraphy standpoint, right? So you've got like different layers, and this I guess would fall under the diversity, equity, and inclusion umbrella, which is you've got different demographics, right? And how do you create the experience for various demographics? Because every demographic within a workforce has something to offer, something good to offer, right? Going back to your comment, John, about me always being positive, right? But there are definitely positive elements to every demographic that's part of that workforce. So how do you, as a talent leader, really think about shaping that experience holistically across the various layers of the organization? And I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to all of these, but that's a question in my mind, right? Is how do you really think about the strategy and execute it all the way down to like your HR policies, right? and the procedures, because those actually, they're the lowest common denominator in terms of how your people are experiencing your culture. So
Yeah.
I'll pause there. I know I threw a lot at the group
No,
here,
and
but
it certainly makes sense. And I was actually going to, play the hard host of saying, well, would you even theoretically be able to answer that question that you brought up of what you already said? That's a whole lot of stuff to bite off. But I
right.
guess, from your talent management or talent branding perspective, what are some of the things that you're seeing just with trends of what some places are trying to do in regards to, you know, maybe proactively tackling some of these?
Yeah. I will say transparency and authenticity are like the two big things. With that backdrop, with the trust barometer, report that I mentioned, I think if you look at what's happening out there, I think people, employees or candidates, and frankly our families and friends as well, right? They want more transparency and authenticity. And of course, in the post-COVID world, people became more human, right? Like we got used to seeing each other's families on Zoom and
Mm.
that's seen, right? And I think a lot of that, what happened and where we come from in the last 4 years, is a product of that. Is people want to see more humans behind a corporation, and when you think about branding, one of the things we're seeing, what I mean by transparency is like, hey, share real stories. Don't be afraid to get employees to really share their stories, that are a true reflection of how they experience the organization, right, that they work in. Positive and or constructive, right? But how do you narrate that story as a talent leader is huge, internally as well as externally.
And then to layer that on top of what you're talking about with trust, you can't have that transparency without that trust overall umbrella happening. And that's, an interesting conundrum to go back and forth on, with a lot of what talent management leaders are going through these days.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So, and it's not, yeah, I think, so those are the trends I'm seeing is how do you balance trust and transparency with the corporate guardrails?
Yep.
That exist for, of course, a reason, right? Corporations have existed for eons. But I think the fabric is changing in terms of how that interaction is. And of course, it'll change because we're talking about generations. I do think it's going to evolve to be more transparent and more authentic because that's what, like, I have a 12-year-old son. He's all over TikTok looking at real people pushing different products, right? So the consumerization of that is huge, and that's going to permeate within organizations in years to come.
Perfect. All right, Lauren, I'm going to throw it over to you for, some of your thoughts, considering it's your birthday. I should have went with you first, actually.
No worries at all. I loved hearing Amit's answer, and yeah, it was great to hear. So, I feel like I have to start with prioritizing growth opportunities. I'd say that my generation is extremely ambitious, and I don't know how that compares to others. I'm sure there are many people that are ambitious, but we're known for being ambitious. Especially with this AI shift. I mean, I'd be remiss to not mention it. We are incredibly talented with technology, and there are huge business goals riding on our skills with software and with our ability to manage and generate AI products. It goes back to what Amit was saying. It's extremely important to prioritize growth opportunities for them, especially if you're looking to retain those employees and just give them opportunities within your organization and allow them to do their best work. I think part of allowing them to do their best work is also embracing the flexibility that Gen Z craves and fostering a more inclusive culture. I think benefits are also important to this. So again, I have to mention AirVet because I am excited about them. It is a multi-generational benefit. And, a few years ago, we had this parenthood at work boom, right? And now we're seeing my generation who has far fewer children. And right now, 70% of the workforce has pets, while only 30% of the workforce has children at home. And that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I know Amit loves his data. So there you go. And that's part of what got me excited about joining AirVet, actually, was because they are doing something that appeals to a large portion of people, not just one generation. And that's also why I was excited to talk here, because I think that it's really important that we understand that there are differences between these groups of people, and we appeal to not one specific set, and we include everyone to be able to do their best work.
And I don't think the three of you even know this, but Lauren was really one of the things that when she and I were connected, she was really the impetus behind this webinar in regards to that generational difference. And the reason being is that she said something very interesting in regards to the, new employees or interns, where in the past, and Lauren, you'll be able to do a much better job of explaining this and walking it through, but started out as being the people who could be getting coffee or helping, seasoned individuals in the company get their work done in hopes that they could follow through with what's going on. But nowadays, oftentimes these younger individuals coming into the company have the skill set already that are now in the company. Lauren, did you want to expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. Yeah, it is interesting. This is something that I was ranting to John about. Is my confidant. So I think it's very interesting to watch the shift of these individuals that came up, whether it was in high school or right in college, right out of college, that really learned how to harness technology, and they have really amazing skills that are not always um, perfectly set up for a certain workforce role. I think a lot of times we think when an intern is entering into an organization, they're the ones that typically do the work that is that no one else wants to do, right? I'll just say it like that. And um, to be honest with you, we're missing out by doing that, because they have all these skills that a lot of times, whether it's related to AI, software development, um, or other, we're just completely missing them. We're not utilizing their skill set, and they don't really have the opportunity to learn the way that they used to. Before, you were shadowing people, you had time to understand, how the organization worked. Now you're being asked to just jump in, start these incredibly large projects sometimes with little to no skills. And Amit, I would love to hear from you on this, because I know that you've done a lot of research on this. Like, how do we give them those skills before they are just asked to work on these incredibly difficult projects sometimes, as sometimes new grads?
Yeah, I'm sorry, John. I feel like we're
No, this is
monopolizing.
perfect. I love it.
From a skill standpoint, that's a huge area of discussion. I think we probably need like multiple sessions just on skills alone, and then how we
That'll be
define.
next month. We'll talk about that.
Right. I will say, like, I think we all know this, right? Like 80% of learning happens on the job, right? Um, and so to your point, Lauren, right? When folks are put into projects or jobs, it is kind of like, hey, we're going to throw you on the deep end, right? Without a whole lot of support. Um, it depends on the culture of the organization as well, right? But generally, we see a lot of that, and a lot of the learning happens on the job. Now, I think the downside to that, to your point, it's not structured in any way. You've got layers, spans and layers, right? You've got layers that are flattening. So you've got now leaders. Before you would have 6 to 7 direct reports, and slowly I'm seeing upwards of 9 to 11 now, right, on average. And so what's happening is you've got these people leaders who are now who also have generational team, right? And it's a very interesting conundrum, and it also depends on where that leader came from, right? Like what generation they belong to, right? And their upbringing. So you've got a multitude of factors when it relates to skill development. You've got it's almost left to chance, actually. I will say, where you join a particular leader or a department, and your experience might be totally different from another leader you end up reporting to, because they might be completely different in terms of their style and so on as well, right? So I don't think there's a standardized way to look at particular generations and how we treat that generation in terms of development. But I do think it's up to us as leaders to understand what are the motivational factors for each of those generations, and how can we support that in a very equitable way, right? Because you don't want favoritism, right? You don't
Yes.
want all in the workforce,
We
and it
have
is
to advocate for fairness for sure. I mean, absolutely. If you're asking someone if they're a new grad to do more work than you would have asked them to do 10 years ago, you have to think about how are you paying them? Or is the compensation even fair to them? I mean, and I think pay transparency was incredibly important when that first started coming up. And it's too bad that so many states have not implemented like salary bands being on job boards. I know we could go deeply into that too. But I definitely think that advocating for fairness across the board is just so important. If someone's working on a project at a level that maybe they wouldn't have 10 years ago, it's important to compensate them fairly.
Which then ties
absolutely.
perfectly into what Amit was saying with that trust and transparency of having that, and that being a critical part. And one other quick thing, just going back to what you were saying, Lauren, about having the ability for people to grow and learn while they're there. It's oftentimes why you'll see a lot of secondment programs fail these days is because people will use them as, here's all the work I want to give to this person that I don't want to do. And that's not really the way that it should be approached. It should be more of, here's the work that I love doing, but I need to unload that on this other person because that's where the learning is. They're not going to learn with building out a project plan or doing the budget behind it as much as they are with more of the things that are associated with the fun or enthusiasm with those talent specific processes. So perfect. Thank you. So John,
Yes.
so I don't know which way to really take this with you
It's like,
because when you
yeah,
and
I know
I,
you're probably saying, like, do you have anything to say here?
well, I was even going to say because when you and I had talked, we took the different tact of also the data, but that ties into what Amit and Lauren were just talking about, where some of this stuff is not necessarily generational;
Right.
it's just the talent. And
Well, it's a
what are some
couple
of
of
the
things.
things?
I mean, I've
Yeah.
been reflecting on what both Lauren and Amit have been talking about. Um, but if I take that back to the beginning, right, which is, so what's missing from talent management, or what are they avoiding, or what more could they do?
Overlooked, according to
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And and a big part for me is the data analytics, right? I mean, both our guests here have talked about stats, right? Research that's being done. So there's that piece of how do you bring that into the organization to make better decisions and policies, right? Then there's also, like, collecting data and analyzing it in your own organization. I think a big part of the success I had at the Hartford, and I think I had it too, was not taking things for granted and really studying, like, gathering the data, analyzing it, figuring out what that means, right, and then doing something with that. And so that's one piece, which is, I don't think there's enough going on, right? And I also think that talent management is there's sort of two pieces to this in my mind. The concept of talent management, which I think is really the goal of HR in general, right? And I can talk some more about that, but and then there's the department of talent management, which a lot of organizations look like as if that's not part of HR, right? That's something different. So that's a little confusing. On the generational differences, and this is what you and I talked about in the area of saying, okay, how do we learn from science, right? How do we learn from our own data? Um, if we go back to stats, right, and um, experimental psychology, some of the stuff in my background, you look at comparison of groups. The very first thing I think of when you ask me about generational differences, I think, well, we tend to want to classify people in generations a certain way with certain characteristics, right? Which is fine. But statistics tells us that there's as much variation within a group as there is between groups, right? And so if you're in a particular generation, yeah, there are maybe some things to be thinking about in terms of what exposure you've had and what society around you have shaped. But there's also, like, great variation within that group, right? And so you have to be careful, not to have sort of sweeping generalities about any particular group of people, but really gather the right data, right? And then and integrate that into what you're doing.
So this is one of the questions I wanted to ask coming into this to you, John. So I wasn't going to let you get off that easy with, we need to use, data more in talent management because I 1000% agree with that. My question to you is, why do you think there's a hesitation?
I don't know that there's the skill level there yet. I think, and I also think we make some assumptions about, I think, talent management and training. I mean, you were talking about this, right? Your point about training. People think, yeah, well, the number one thing to do is like send people to training, and then, and it's like, yeah, but very little transfers back to the job, unless you build in some other structures, right? And then there's other things you can do, but it's like, okay, but yet it still persists because we think that's the right thing to do. And I think so. I think there's a lot of those ways that people act on assumptions that they make, sort of makes sense, right? But when you really look behind that, it's like, no, it doesn't really. And so um, it requires a lot of effort. And when I think about a big part of my background was talent acquisition, right? So I ran all of talent acquisition for the Hartford, amongst other jobs that I've had. And it's easy for a lot of organizations to say, well, we're not getting enough people, they're not qualified enough, right? And say, oh, you know what? But then when we did a very elaborate analytic process, I went out to every business leader, of major organizations, Hartford, and laid out sort of a two-page thing. Here's what happened in your organization last year, and here's what happened so far this year. And they had no idea. I mean, I had people say, really? That's how long it took to get jobs filled? Yeah. Why are people complaining? Because of the way we do it, right? So there's also a piece, I guess, of this of educating people on what the data means, how it relates to them. I think, one of the things that really helped, at least at the Hartford, was educating the people that ran those organizations about what really goes on from an HR perspective. They had no idea. I mean, really,
Now,
totally.
yeah, no, so you bring that up, it's interesting. And, just with talking to a bunch of different people, I think, one of the biggest frustrations are, especially from a data perspective side, is, HR or people experience, or, however it's being framed these days, does a very good job of doing those intake surveys of, our pulse survey, or a yearly thing that they can do. They crunch the numbers and they do exactly that, John. They, go out to the business and say, here are things that we could be doing better. And then more often than not, it's just left there. It just stagnates. The next year comes up, and those same problems more often than not are still there, which ultimately makes, individuals say, well, what's the point of taking this survey if nothing is being done about it? And maybe it goes back to your initial, comment of being able to also flip it to say, now it's time to implement these, and here are some of the things that we can start doing, versus, well, I have a data team, they report under me, which means I'm using analytics, but are you using analytics in an effective manner to elicit change in an organization? And I think that's sometimes where it might struggle, and I could be wrong. But I wasn't sure what anyone else had to kind of their knee-jerk reaction to that statement would be.
Yeah, I can jump in here. Engagement survey, since you brought that up, is near and dear to my heart, right? And I think I think what happens is you get a lot of actions. So first of all, actually, I'll back up. So the questions and the way they're asked are so generic and so high level
Yes.
that it becomes very difficult for like a frontline employee to really understand the action that might even come out of something like that. Right, right. So like a question might be, do you get enough, does your organization provide enough learning and growth opportunities? Right. That is literally one of the questions I remember. Right, right, right,
Who would say yes, I get enough of that?
right. Or maybe whatever the scale is, right? But it is so broad, and I think that's where organizations typically fall off, right? To have it be meaningful to that individual, right? Um, and I do think, right, from a trend standpoint, I do think organizations that actually provide a more personalized experience, I think will be the ones that will win in the marketplace from a talent perspective.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, though, right? So
Yeah.
how do you craft? How do you really understand what your workforce, like having a real pulse on your workforce? Um, we do have major leadership challenges as well, right? So because HR departments are always asked to, we're always strapped for budget, we're always strapped for resources. You have to kind of come up with that ecosystem where you are leveraging leadership to be an extension of your culture, right? And how do you equip the leaders in a very pragmatic way, right? It can't be like, okay, hey, in your department, the score was you're not providing enough learning opportunities to your team.
Right.
There's an action guide for you to go and take.
Right. Have a nice life. Yeah.
Yes. Good luck.
Instead, maybe the action should be like, hey, look, during your one-on-ones, what are you talking about? Right?
Yeah.
With your teams. So there you've got to have actions that are very pragmatic, like down to the meat of what people actually care about. Right?
That is so incredibly true. Not to jump in, but
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
heard a
Oh,
lot of talk
perfect.
about the stereotyping and the generalization, especially of my, generation, because it is about that. I mean, we're extremely adaptable and we're willing to embrace the change at different organizations. And we're living in a time when things have never been changing faster than they are right now. And that's so important to remember. Like, we are in a really interesting time. And that includes recruiting, new people into the workforce. But managers need to allow this creativity with all of their employees, not just certain groups, because there are generalizations made. These one-on-ones are completely useless sometimes. Some organizations, if they're small, they don't even have an HR leader. They don't even have a chief people officer. They don't have a VP of people. And it's really terrifying to me. So the organizations that don't have that, you really need to be thinking, who is training the managers? How are you giving them those resources to be able to empower their employees? How are they getting that knowledge to be able to do that? Because it's changing so fast. Are we just assuming that they're using their own career knowledge to then teach people that are their direct reports? I mean, that's crazy. We have to allow employees to be creative, and to stand up for themselves and share what we want to work on. If they don't feel like they can do that, we're in big trouble.
I'd like to follow a bit of a theme there, Lauren, that you raised. Because I see this all the time, right? So like the phrase of, our managers need to be better leaders in this, or they need to be better trained to do certain things, right? Whether it's flexibility or not. And often I get, organizations will say, yeah, we need to do leadership development, we need to do this training. But no one ever remembers to say, like, just what this whole idea, like absorbing the science of the research. I mean, before I said, but like 80% happens on the job. And so, or, vice versa for me to say, how much transfers from a training, right, of some sort to the job? It's like very little, right?
Yep.
10 to 20% maybe. So, and by the way, right, so this relates to talent management thinking broadly, like across the whole lifespan of somebody in the organization. So my point is, often they'll talk about, like, let's make managers better at this stuff. Okay, but if you're training people, you first got to then say, are we going to change the selection criteria for the managers that we hire? Because if you don't, you're going to hire all the same old people who then have to go to training, who aren't going to transfer that to the job anyway. So you're wasting your time there, right? And then, oh, by the way, are you going to compensate them differently? Are you going to is their performance management going to change, right? Are their goals going to change? And most of the time, it's no. It's like, well, you better look at all of that stuff, because otherwise, you're not going to make any progress.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and I will also add. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just
Um,
gonna say, people constantly say, oh, we're going to train our managers. Are you really? Because I feel like it's just people overcomplicate it. And a big thing that
Yes.
I always tell people, they're like, well, how do we make better managers? I mean, in my opinion, a big thing we can all do is just tell people what they're doing well and thank them, because it's just such an easy thing. There's all this manager training. There's one thing that you can just do right now to the people that you are managing. You can just thank them for what they're doing. That's it. Like, and the amount of managers that don't even do that is astronomical. So I don't know. Let's start small and impactful, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think they're so I'm a huge American football fan. So of course we just had the Super Bowl last weekend, right? So I think about coaching trees, right? I mean, you look
Yep.
at Andy Reid, right? And he's got an amazing coaching tree. You've got the Shanahan coaching tree. You've got all these amazing coaching trees, right? And the output is amazing coaches, right? Right? And I always think about this where I think it's role model leadership, right? And you drop a leader from one organization to another, or even one department to another. It's how their leaders and their leaders are behaving, and how they will basically learn those behaviors and essentially become part of that coaching tree,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah,
it becomes super de-stand, or I guess if that's a word, it's just not standardized, right? And what ends up
Yep.
happening is you've got even like department to department variations in terms of the experience that employees are facing because of those different coaching trees. I don't know if that makes sense.
no, it does, and it goes
Totally.
right back to what Lauren was talking about with those growth opportunities. Oftentimes, I find that leaders or managers, they are talent hoarders. So, oh, they're making my job easier by making me look better. I'm keeping them close versus really celebrating, Lauren, going back to what you were saying of, hey, we're rewarding talent exporters, people who take their team, make them better, put them into situations that are stretch for them, but will be able to succeed. To go back to what you're saying of creating that tree of leadership for what needs to happen next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, right? You've got hoarders, and then you have, I mean, and again, it goes back to, I mentioned this earlier, your HR policies, right?
Yep. Yeah.
They are super important in terms of how people interact with those policies, what implications those policies have. So I've seen organizations where they have a policy like, you have to be in this particular role for at least 12, or at least 18 months before you can ask for a transfer.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like what does that mean?
What is that trying to solve? And
Right, right.
There are a lot of those too, right? There's a lot of those corporate structures, if you will. I told John a story that was eye-opening for me way back when I worked at the Hartford. I had these recruiting teams reporting to me, and I got invited to sit in with one of the teams. Now, of course, most of the recruiters were young people, right? Different generation than me. And as we're talking, one of the brave folks there said, I don't understand this. How come we have to have an annual bonus plan? What if what if you're really like acing and knocking the ball out of the park, right? Your first 3 months. Why can't I get a bonus then? Right? Why do I have to wait until a year later to get a bonus? Now, generally the answer is because that's the structure of Hartford, right? But really it's like, I have a budget, I have money for bonuses. Guess what? In my world, I can make that decision. So there's part of it that says, don't get stuck in the rules, right? Um, what can you control? And also, I mean, just listening to what's going to be. And I think, Lauren, you were making this point before, right? The flexibility that's needed. And I don't know that a lot of leaders engage that flexibility or feel like they have the ability to do that. But you can change things, right? And you really need to. Anyway.
so we're coming up on somewhat getting close to the end, unfortunately, but I wanted to jump into a couple questions that people have brought up because I think they're very fascinating. I don't know if Lauren's going to have an answer to this one, but I'm going to ask her it anyways.
Of course she is.
What is Lauren's birthday wish for a culture change in HR? I don't know if you're going to know the answer to that.
Oh, I have so many. For, for context, I've worked with so many chief people officers building advisory boards for them throughout my career. Like that's a lot of what I've done, especially recently. And so I will say with the caveat, I am very biased toward their opinion. And I really love listening to the CPOs in my life that are doing incredible work in this space. So just want to give credit where it's due. Um, I think that the move to remote work was amazing. I wish we could do more things that were flexible like that. It doesn't have to be, if you want to go back to office, okay. But can we do something then instead that gives us more flexibility in another way. Maybe it's you choose which time zone you want to work in if you do have to go back to office, or maybe it's you know, certain time off changes, like PTO changes. I just think that the flexibility is going to be lost a little bit. And again, I hate to keep going back to AirVet, but there is a reason I joined this organization, and I think very highly of them. You know, as far as benefits go, maybe you create more flexible benefits for a larger majority of your workforce. Like, for example, AirVet, like I said, covers 70% of the workforce instead of 30% with childcare. That would be an example. So my wish is just to create a little more flexibility, especially if you're trying to take it away with return to office.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So I love that flexibility part in it. It's interesting because we have, prioritize growth, trust and transparency, flexibility, data. John, this question's to you. What analytics have you found to be the most useful in your roles?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I guess I think about a lot of the roles I've had have been, running talent acquisition organizations. And it's easy in companies for leaders to beat up on talent acquisition organizations. We're not getting enough qualified people. We're not getting them fast enough. And so I think if you think about, like, one of the things that we did at the Hartford was basically rewrite the system that supported what we were doing so that we could do better analytics and better reporting. And then we can make some decisions about, so what's really helpful, right? Jobs filled. And what do we need to change to do that? And then with that particular information, right? So some of it's standard, right? Okay, how long has it been taking us to fill a job? How diverse have the candidate slates been? How many people are in the talent pool that we need? Are there different roles that would drive the organization forward, right? So gathering that, so information like that, I think that we can study ourselves internally. I'm not to dismiss the external information, but I think that's a miss for a lot of us. So that's the kind of data I've used in the past, right, to make changes that have actually turned around, like the quality of the organization, right? In this case, like the speed at which we can respond to what the needs are, the quality level of the people. And we did at one point we did a study of quality of folks that got hired by the organization, and after they've been there a year or two, what's their performance? And the highest performing people, where did they come from? Right? What was the source? What was the method? Right? It's that kind of data, right? That most organizations don't seem to pay attention to.
Or the inverse, where are the
Right.
people that we got that left after 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and what happened there?
Right. And why was that, right? And if I could take one more second on that, we did a massive study when I was at the Hartford, head of HR for the IT organization. Right? And they were losing people all the time, and they basically wanted to address the turnover problem with, let's give people more money. Like, no, let's find out, like, why they're not staying. And oh, by the way, when we did a cut of, like, the people that had left the organization by performance level, it was the highest performers were leaving. Like, well, that's scary, right? And then say, okay, so now let's ask these people, right? How about that? We did a study of people that left in the last 2 years and why they left. Big surprise, none of them left because of compensation, although they did better, but they did say that wasn't it. It was the management leadership, right? The roles that they were in and the people that managed them, and there's a lot of other things too. But it allowed us to then change our whole leadership model within IT. Right? And select people differently, train them differently for those leadership roles, and had a massive effect on the organization.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amit, this last question's for you, and then we'll probably get a couple more as they trickle in. But this has to do with the engagement surveys. It bubbled up a couple of different questions, but I'm going to summarize all of them into one for you. How, in your view, could we do them better? And this goes back to engagement surveys. And you talked about, the nebulousness of questions. It could be, reserved for a year. Or are there more, do you think, creative ways to elicit feedback from talent populations?
Yeah, great question. I'm smiling because I think you and I may have chatted about this like early on. So I do think the moment you ask somebody for like formal feedback, like through the survey mechanism that we typically are used to collecting feedback, you're already changing the outcome in the minds of people, right? Just by the process of you reaching out and saying, "Hey, I want you to give me feedback." Um, yes, there will be a certain percentage of the population that will give you real feedback, but 9 times out of 10, doesn't matter how many times you tell them this is anonymous, right? There's always this thinking in the back of the employees' minds that really it's really anonymous. I don't know,
What's
right?
that trust and transparency that you keep bringing up?
Right. So there is that. So my personal belief and my experience is, if you are an amazing HR partner or a talent leader, or you have enough teams in it, and I understand the scalability is an issue because of tight budgets and so on. But a better way to get a pulse on the organization is to John's point, right? Like, if you're talk to your recent leavers, or talk to your recent new hires, connect with the people, because HR is kind of in a unique position. They're kind of that bridge between management and the frontline employees, right? There's nobody else in that organization that plays that role, right? Of course, the leader does, but the leader is considered management, right? Um, and so, my advice or suggestion would be to really, one of the things I used to do as an HR business partner was to just connect with the leadership team, understand where their hotspots were from a business standpoint, but also then connect with folks. Like I would literally just email folks who are leaving, right? And I would just say, look, I know you're going to get an exit survey from the corporation, but can we just go out for lunch if you have time? Or can I call you for 10 minutes, right? Those 10 minutes in a conversation that's not recorded or anything, right? You gather so much insight about that particular department. Now, you're not after anybody, you're just trying to understand the realities of the challenges of that particular department. But I do understand kind of it's not a scalable model, right? So that's why you have these survey mechanisms in place. But it's just my take on surveys is I take it with a grain of salt. It's directional at best. You've got to really understand and have a pulse through other means, like I mentioned.
There is
Perfect.
an interesting one, if I can mention it. I call it prove it feedback. I really like this for managers that want to elicit feedback from their direct reports. So basically, it would be the manager is scheduled to go to each of their direct reports and say, let's work on a project together. And we're going to have this scorecard or some way of gauging how it's going along the way. And it allows the person that is reporting to that manager to speak up in the moment and say, oh, actually, it works better for me when you do X, Y, or Z. And then at the conclusion of the project, you can then go back and there's been data along the project lines to say, hey, this is what worked, this is what didn't. And then it gives the employee an opportunity to speak up and say, hey, this didn't work well for me, or this prevents me from doing my best work. And it's just a way to be honest without feeling like you are being cornered into giving good feedback to a manager.
So I know we have a little bit of time left. There was a really good question that I wanted to open it up to all three of you, and it's going to hopefully bring a smile to all of your faces. The question is, what are the top qualities you would look for if you were hiring the head of HR?
No, I can start if you want. So, and I'm, of course, I'm looking at this from a CEO's lens now because we're scaling this hyper growth SaaS company now, right? So I'm looking at, if not now, but whenever I do look to hire a chief people officer, I'd be looking for somebody who really understands the business, number one, right? The levers they need to pull to help this company grow, empathetic leader, right? Like really understanding and has a good pulse on what it takes to hire amazing people, what it takes to retain amazing people. And that goes down to the policies I mentioned, right? Like it's the whole approach, right? Those would be the two things that I would look for.
Lauren, John?
I can
Oh,
go.
oh,
go
go ahead, Lauren.
So I would say that, and I've met many heads of HRs, but I think that people confuse good culture with culture that is in line with the business objectives. So as Amit was saying, maybe it means that they're extremely tech savvy and everyone they hire is really passionate about being into super deep into tech, or maybe they're animal lovers like at AirVet, but creating a culture that is reflective of the organization that you want to build and scale. I think that's especially true for early stage startups, but I'll mention it.
I was going to add, so I agree with everything I've heard so far. I would try to get at an integrative mindset, right? What I was talking about before is like, there's not this answer. There's, what do we need to do across, right, to drive the organization forward, right? So the simple idea that, what I was talking about before, it's not about just development. It's not just about, it's how do you pull all those together, right, and get them all in the same direction to serve the business. So I agree that sort of business foundation, I think is really important. But it's not just like, oh, we're going to do one of my pet peeves is, oh, we're in HR, we're support to the business, right? So some organizations think it's a support service to the business. Like, well, I don't think of it that way. I think it's a strategic resource, right? Help the business be better. And I would look for that kind of mindset from the head of HR.
Oh, I love it. My thing I always go back to, I'll answer this. I'll jump in too, because I'm jealous
Yeah.
of the three of you being able to talk about this. I would always look for a leader who is effective communication, but in a very interesting way. Effective communication is 80% listening. So you want those individuals to really be able to actively listen to be able to act then afterwards. More often, I think that, the higher up you go, the more advice you need to give. And that might not always be the best thing to do given in certain situations, but that's just my 2 cents. We are at 55 after. Somehow that time flew by. I cannot thank the three of you enough. Amit, Lauren, John, you've been amazing. Unfortunately, we had a ton of comments. We only answered 5 of about 25 of them. So we need to keep going. But I just wanted to bring up a couple of the themes that I was seeing during this conversation. And hopefully it starts to resonate with people the importance of it, because I think that all 4 of us can agree that they were very important to what we're looking at, regardless of where we are in our life or where we work. So prioritizing that growth opportunities, that goes to you, Lauren. Thank you. I like how I'm pointing to where the square is on my screen. That trust and transparency, Amit, that you really started to kick off there, that came up in a number of different times and in a number of different situations about the importance of that and how you can't have one with the other. But these are also the bedrock of what a lot of things can be built up on top of that's required. The flexibility. So being able to have that flexibility in a variety of creative ways. And then finally, the data. So John, going back to being able to, instead of being a reacting organization or a arm of an organization, it's how can we use data in a proactive way by getting it correctly from individuals to be able to then successfully implement it to be better. Versus, hey, we have a problem and now we have to scramble to fix it. It should be, yes, this could happen within a year. Let's be a little bit more proactive to implement it. So thank you, all 3 of you, for your time. I really appreciate it. This is the highlight of my week. Thank you for making it. And thank you on behalf of a lot of people who came to watch this. The information that you've provided them is giving them a lot of, number one, food for thought, but also allowing people who might not have access to speaking engagements like this or quick access to them, a learning opportunity to, again, grow as individuals and hopefully find that place in, this world where they're able to bring their passion for talent management into these situations. So thank you, all 3 of you. I cannot.
Great job, John. Great job
I
facilitating and
Thank you. Thank you, John.
knitting our different ideas together. That was great.
See, I have my talents every once in a while.
Brilliant.
But thank you again. And for those on the call, thank you so much for being on here. We really appreciate it. And feel free to subscribe to our channel because we're going to be using this forum as an ongoing process for people to continue to learn and grow within the HR space. Thank you again, everyone.